Yes, so the stream has started.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the afternoon session of QMAT 2021. Today we have a very special lecture by Ania Wronski, who is a publisher with IOP Publishing, and she's a publisher of the Journal of Physics Condensed Matter. And of course, all physicists, young and old, has this eternal question about how to get published. And Ania will give us some guidance and we'll talk about how to get published in physics and so on. So over to you, Ania.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rajeep, for that introduction. So as mentioned, I'm a publisher working at the Institute of Physics Publishing on the material science portfolio. And one of the journals I work on is the Journal of Physics Condensed Matter, which might be of interest to some of you in the audience. So please feel free to post questions throughout the talk. There will be time at the end to get to them, so please feel free to use the chat box. Also, I must apologize, we've got some sun coming in, so if the kind of contrast in my face disappears throughout, apologies. But to begin the session, I wanted to take you through a brief introduction of the Journal of Physics Condensed Matter. So this is a flagship, part of our flagship Journal of Physics series, which is now over 50 years old. Originally, the journal was 2 parts and it was joined to form the Journal of Physics Condensed Matter. It's run by the editor-in-chief, Professor Gianfranco Paccioni from the University of Milano Bicocca in Italy, alongside myself and a journal editor at IOP. The journal is generally very well respected and reliable. It's seen as trusted and has a high quality peer review process. In recent years, and as you'll see here, we have a very broad coverage. In recent years, we've expanded that coverage to include more increasingly interdisciplinary areas, such as the physics of chemical processes and the computational and experimental methods section, which publishes some highly cited electronic structure codes. You'll be able to find the scope online if you follow the URL there at the bottom, but I wanted to highlight this in context of what we'll be talking about later on. In particular, I wanted to point out the last paragraph of the scope, which describes the novelty and quality criteria. So you see here that it says, papers should contain significant and original new science and make a substantial advance in a particular field. So this is important and we'll discuss why later on. Also, I wanted to mention that IOP Publishing recently signed the DORA agreement, which is an agreement to showcase alternative metrics other than the impact factor. So we now have a suite of other metrics, both on the peer review and citation metrics, available on our website, which gives you a more kind of rounded view of the journal, I guess. So here's a snapshot of the peer review metrics. And the acceptance rate is again something that you might want to consider, and we'll discuss that why later on. And we also have the citation-based metrics, which, as well as impact factor, we offer some of the citation-based metrics there. I also wanted to highlight that we publish various different types of articles. So the journal publishes original research, it publishes special issue articles, as well as letters. And more recently, we started publishing perspective articles. And this is an example of a special issue that we recently did with Amit Dutta and Krishnendu Sengupta on quantum dynamics research in India. And it's available online if you follow the URL there. And you can find lots of research papers and topical reviews that contributed to this special issue. So moving on to the bulk of my talk, which will be covering how to get published. So we'll start off with a brief introduction to IOP Publishing before moving on to talking about how you can choose your journal. And the advice here will be broadly applicable to publishing in general, not just IOP. We'll then move on to some of the key points about writing your paper and what to look out for and what to focus your energy on, before looking at the peer review process in some more detail and rounding off with a bit about publication ethics and what you can do post-publication to increase the impact of your paper. So starting off, a brief introduction to IOP. So IOP stands for the Institute of Physics. We're based in the UK, so it's a UK institute. The publishing part of the Institute of Physics has headquarters in Bristol in the UK, although we have staff worldwide. And we're very much, we are a learned society publisher. So all of the money that we make goes to the Institute to promote, to help it in its activities, which are around promoting physics and physicists. So our mission is to deliver impact, recognition, and value to the scientific community. And as well as a suite of journals, we also have an ebooks program, as well as we publish the science magazine Physics World, which you might have heard of. So here is a map of everywhere where we have IOP offices or IOP representatives. And as you'll see, we're very much an international publisher, although our headquarters are based in the UK. So in India, we have an office in Chennai, as well as representatives in Delhi and Bangalore. So moving on to choosing your journal. So I would say that this is a decision not to be taken lightly. You have to work with a publisher and a journal that you can trust. And unfortunately, these days, not all publishers and journals can be trusted. There are some predatory publishers out there that you certainly want to avoid. So I would recommend doing a bit of research and having a look at the publisher and the journal in detail and looking them up online. There are also many considerations that will affect your choice of journal. So scope and audience are particularly important, as this will affect how you write your paper and the narrative that you tell. So it's a good idea to decide on your journal before you even start writing, as it will affect the messaging and style of your paper. At IOP, it's our mission to provide as many different options as possible to the community. So we have different options that will suit people at different stages of their career. So some of the considerations that you might want to think about are who's reading the journal? Do your peers know about the journal? Whether it's a broad scope journal or a niche scope journal and how that is relevant to your work. Whether it's a theoretical experimental journal or whether it publishes applied research. And it's worth looking at whether the journal publishes similar work to yours. It's really important to look at the quality criteria, as I described earlier in the JPCM scope, and the likelihood of acceptance. You might also want to look at the editorial board and if there's anybody that you recognize on the board. And we'll talk a bit more about impact factor and open access in a bit more detail now. Before that, I also wanted to highlight this Think, Check, Submit website, which provides a really handy checklist that you can use to help you choose your journal. So impact factor is perhaps the most common metric used to compare different journals. And it's the measure of citations an article is likely to pick up 2 years after it's published. So I think it's important to remember that impact factor is not necessarily a measure of quality. It is solely related to citations. So for lower impact factor journals, the work published there is still scientifically sound, but it just might attract less citations than work published in a higher impact journal. Impact factor is also very much field specific. So for an impact factor of 2 in physics is relatively good, for example. There are also alternatives to impact factor, such as site score, immediacy index, and the 5-year impact factor that I showed earlier. Now, if you're interested in the utility of an article, then download levels might be a better metric to look at, as this shows who's actually reading the work. And other metrics now are available via the altmetrics circle, which quite a lot of publishers now use and publish alongside the article. So this shows social media usage, so Twitter, Facebook, as well as Google references and blogs. So it provides a much more rounded view of the paper. Now, I wanted to spend a bit of time discussing journal tiering. So journal tiers will have different different quality and novelty thresholds. So for example, high tier journals with a very high impact factor, such as research reports on progress in physics and 2D materials, will generally have a really high novelty and quality criteria. So they'll be looking for publishing groundbreaking work that's making a really big impact in a particular field. Whilst mid-tier journals, such as the Journal of Physics Condensed Matter and the New Journal of Physics, will still have high novelty and quality thresholds, but the focus won't necessarily be on making a very big impact, but more on the correct science and making a substantial contribution to a particular field. Whilst if you look at lower tier journals, so in IOP, we have a suite of express titles covering different subjects. And the focus of these journals is very much looking at whether the science is correct rather than whether there is novelty. So you might want to think about this in terms of when you're choosing your journal, as it could be a really good guide. Then open access is another issue which is growing in importance. So traditionally, journals were subscription journals where they were free to publish in, but libraries pay for access. Now there's been an increasing number of gold open access journals that have been launched, and this is where the articles are made freely available to anybody to read. However, the author or their funder typically has to pay an article processing charge for publishing. Most IOP journals are now hybrid journals, so they were traditionally subscription journals, but now also offer the option of publishing open access. So they're kind of the best of both worlds. Now we'll talk a bit about writing your paper, and I'll tease out some of the things that I think are really important to pay attention to. So before you even start, it's worth asking yourself, do you have enough to actually write a paper? Look at your main results and check if they are novel and important enough, and do they fill a gap in the research? Again, look at your choice of journal and look at their requirements, as this will help you decide on the key message of your paper. It's important to have a clear message in your paper so the reader can understand what exactly you have done and why it is important. And once you have that, you can start building your structure. Now, the structure of papers might vary from field to field, but generally they'll follow this. They'll follow these elements, or they'll include these elements. Now, I'm going to focus on the ones that I think are particularly important, which I've highlighted in bold there. So the title, abstract, introduction, methodology, and the figures. So the title is almost obviously important because it is the first thing that the reader sees. It is definitely the most visible part of your paper. So you want this to be concise and yet informative, and even better if you have something that draws the reader's attention. And importantly, you want it to be easily discoverable via an online search, as this is how most researchers will now find content. So make sure you keep it simple, be clear and descriptive, and include all your key terms. Don't be ambiguous, don't use phrases or jokes that might not translate across cultures, and don't use any acronyms. Then your abstract is another extremely important part of your paper. Now, this is the shop window of paper. It's really what's going to sell your paper to your readers and encourage them to read on. So you want to provide a one-paragraph summary and include your key results and describe exactly what you achieved. So do include keywords and phrases. Be clear about what makes the paper worth reading, why it is novel, and summarize your aims, methodology, and findings. Don't just copy your introduction, make sure you're rewriting your abstract. Don't use jargon or undefined acronyms, and definitely don't exaggerate or mislead or make more of your work than it is. I would really recommend spending a lot of time on the title and abstract, as this is the thing that most people will see first and judge your work on. You might even want to write these at the very end, once you really understand what your results are. Then moving on, we have your introduction. You should use this to describe your main goals and advances and provide an overview of your methodology. You want to use the references to show how your work is new and why it is significant. And in the methodology, it's really important to provide enough information to make your results reproducible. There's been a number of high-profile cases of papers retracted for this very reason, so it's important that you provide enough information in this section. So figures are another aspect of the paper that I think is really important. Again, when somebody looks at a paper, they often scroll down and have a look at the figures as the first thing they do. So you want your figures to be clear, representative, and it's worth spending some time on making sure that they are well designed. Another tip is that I would recommend making sure that the figures are self-contained so that a reader looking at them can understand the figures without having to refer to the text. So provide as much information as you need to do that in the figure caption. It's also worth having a think about how the figures might be used post-publication. For example, if you're lucky, they might be featured on a journal cover, or they might be included in our marketing materials or on some social media posts. So, and once you've written your paper, I think it's really important to kind of do a pre-review before you send it to a journal. So that means getting informal feedback from friends, colleagues, your supervisor, or if you have a formal internal review process, make sure you use it. It's also important to think about the English language. So if English isn't your native language, you might want to think about getting it professionally read before you submit to a journal. And this will save you time in the peer review process later on. The reviewers will be looking primarily at the content, but if they can't read your paper, then obviously that's going to be a sticking point. So you've written your paper and you've now submitted it to your journal. So we're going to discuss an overview of the peer review process, in particular how it works at IOP. So there are different models of peer review. Most common in physics is the single anonymous or single blind, which is where the reviewers can see who the author are, but the authors cannot see who the reviewer is. However, at IOP, we've now adopted double anonymous or double blind across all of our hybrid titles. So that means that both those identities of the author and the referee are blinded. Now, this is still optional, so you can still choose to reveal your identity as an author if you wish. Other review types are open peer review. This is where the reports are signed. Transparent peer review. This is where the reports are published alongside the final paper. We also have collaborative peer review and post-publication peer review as other types. So be sure to check what peer review process your journal follows so that you're aware of how it works. So here is a snapshot of the whole peer review process. After submission, there'll often be a check of initial criteria before the first round of peer review. Typically, there is another round of peer review before the article is published. Now we'll go through that in a bit more detail. So once a manuscript is submitted to a journal, it is checked by editorial staff against the scope, quality, and novelty criteria of that journal. They'll also be looking at whether the research is incremental. For example, as I mentioned before, high quality, top tier and mid tier journals will often not accept incremental work. However, those lower tier journals, the express titles, incremental work might be more acceptable in those journals. We'll also use a piece of software called Authenticate to detect plagiarism and duplication. We might consult the editorial board if necessary, if we're unsure. If the paper is not suitable or found not suitable at this stage, it might be rejected outright or transferred to a different tier of journal or a journal with a different scope. And otherwise, it would be sent out to referees. Now, referees are chosen based on their expertise as well as their availability. And then these referees are asked to rate an article based on the scientific rigor, novelty, and significance. Again, they'll be referring back to the journal's scope and the journal novelty and quality requirements to guide them on this. And normally we would require at least 2 reports, and that typically takes a month. And if those reports disagree, we might then consult an adjudicator or an editorial board member in that scenario. Then, based on these reports, a decision is made by the editorial team, and immediate acceptance is usually really unusual, but it does happen in some scenarios. More often than not, authors are then asked to revise their paper based on the referee's comments. And it's worth noting that rejection rate can be high. In some cases, it can be more than 50% for high quality journals, such as those top tier and mid-tier journals. Now, if you've been asked to respond to referees' comments, I'd say this is a great sign, because it means the referees see that there's merit in your paper, and they also think that it fits in with the journal. So I'd recommend you read the reports very carefully and take some time to do this. You want to respond to each and every comment. And it's worth keeping a list of all your changes and highlighting them in the revised manuscript so that the second review process can go more smoothly. If you disagree with a referee, and you might, you can explain this in a clear, polite way in your response. It's important that you never ignore a comment, and even if you don't understand it, I would recommend raising it with the editorial office so you can provide, so they can provide you some more details. And ultimately, this is free advice, so make the most of it and use it to improve your paper. So once you've submitted your revisions, your paper will then be resent back to the referees. And if they are satisfied with the revisions, they will accept your paper. Or alternatively, they might reject it if they feel that the revisions are not strong enough, or you might be asked to make further revisions, and there would be another round of peer review. So if your paper has been rejected, then try not to be disheartened, because I'm sure it's happened to everyone. Everyone has experienced rejection at some point. If the science is correct, you can use the advice that you've gained from the peer review process to then improve your paper further. You can rewrite and potentially resubmit to another journal, for example. Again, it's worth thinking back to those different journal tiers and having a think about if you might want to drop down a tier and go for a journal that has a higher chance of getting, you have a higher chance of getting accepted in. However, if you think the decision was wrong, most journals give you an opportunity to appeal that decision, usually within a month's time frame. On the other hand, if you've been accepted, then congratulations, it's time to celebrate. You might need to check the journal if there's anything more that you need to do. Typically, a journal will ask you to then sign and complete a copyright form, which assigns the copyright to the publisher. They'll usually also ask for proof of permissions at this stage. This will include a permission for any reproduced figures or third-party material. And you'll also be asked to upload source files normally. We'll now have a look at publication ethics, and I'll provide some top tips on this, as it's an important topic. So, do be honest in making claims for your results. Make sure you credit all of those people who have made a significant contribution. Check your funder's policy, as they might have some particular policy on their copyright or require open access publication.
Ania, just one thing, we are at 25 minutes, so just give me a total session is 30 minutes, so depending on how long you want to take.
Oh, okay,
questions.
That's fine. We can just wrap up this here.
No, you continue, but okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajdeep. Okay, make sure you disclose any funding or potential conflicts of interest, and get permission to reuse anything that you haven't created yourself. You want to ensure that you respond to all the reviewers' comments, even if you don't agree with them. And then don't fabricate or falsify any data. Don't submit an article to more than one journal at a time. This is often a policy most journals adopt, but it's primarily there because if in a scenario where the article was accepted to be published in both journals, those journals would then be in copyright breach of one another. Don't add someone as a co-author without their permission. At IOP, that author would then receive an email confirmation when the permission is made, when the submission is made, and they might be a bit confused. And don't sign any forms on behalf of your co-authors without the authorization to do so. And don't copy and paste from other articles. Write everything in your own words wherever possible. And try not to take criticism of the work personally, and always keep professional. Now, I have a few slides on post-publication, but I'm going to just go to the end and provide you with basically a brief summary. So in terms of post-publication, I think it's important to use your own networks. So whether that is using, if you have a website, update that. If you have an institutional website, make sure you update that with your latest publications. If you're at a conference or at a meeting, you can include a slide or a reference to your paper in a talk. And if you've referenced other work, I would say feel free to send those people a link to your own work, as I'm sure they'll appreciate to see it. But basically, you can also use social media. I think the author can be a really important tool when it comes to the impact of growing the impact of their work. So of course we can help as well. We'll include papers in the collections and marketing materials, but I think it's important that you are a champion of your own kind of promotion and advocacy as well. So to sum up, I wanted to include this additional training that we offer. So if I've spoken about publishing, but if you're looking at an introduction to peer reviewing, so if you want to start peer reviewing, we offer this free training course, which is available online. And that is the end of my talk.
Okay. Thank you, Ania, for this very, very informative talk and session. We can take maybe a couple of questions. So Pratap, please go ahead. Anybody who has questions can raise hands, but we may be able to take only a few. Yeah. Pratap, go ahead.
Hi, Ania. So this was a very informative talk. I have a question. What is the policy of IOP regarding statement of individual contribution in the case of multi-author papers?
Statements of individual contributions. So the copyright, it will be jointly signed by all the co-authors.
No, I'm not talking of the copyright. I'm talking of, there are many authors where if you have a multi-author paper, then often there is a statement at the end that you can include of who has done what.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I'm sure. Yeah.
About that in IOP?
I'm not sure, I'm afraid, Pratap. I assume we would have a policy on that and that we could include that. We're quite flexible when it comes to these things, but I can find out for you and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Krishnendu?
Yeah, Ania, just one quick clarification. So typically in journals, when you are submitting a paper, many of them encourage you to send a list of potential referees. Okay, so how much importance does IOP give to that? I mean, do you necessarily choose somebody from that list of potential referees, or maybe only if they're available, or maybe not? I mean,
so that is something that we do, and we ask authors to submit a list of referees. As quite often, the authors themselves will be very knowledgeable about the field and will know who the right people are to report on their work and to understand their work. So we add those names into the mix when we're choosing referees. So we might not necessarily choose them, but they're certainly added to the pool And I would say typically we aim to invite no more than 7 referees per article. So quite often we go through quite a number of referees who say no before we can get those 2 reports. So it's really helpful to have those suggested referees from authors, because they might be the better people and they might be available to report on the work. But we will also add in people from our own database and existing reviewer pool from the journal. So it's kind of a mix, but those suggestions are very helpful and we do consider them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ania. So I don't see any other raised hands. So let's thank Ania Wronski once again for this very, very informative session and very informative talk. So we will gradually close this session so that we can go on to the next academic session, which is going to